introduction, we want to talk about the land, but particularly the land in which Jesus spent most of his life, in which he carried out most of his public ministry. And that's the land of Galilee, called by Isaiah the prophet in chapter 9 of his book, Galilee of the Gentiles. Our story, as far as understanding the life of Jesus is concerned, begins in the year 6 BC. This is the year in which Jesus was born. Now, we say he was a man ahead of his time. He's the best example of that, I suppose. There was a miscalculation in the change of the calendar several centuries ago, and they made an error of about 6 years. So that Jesus is not born in year 1 or year 0, but he's actually born in 6 BC. He's born in the little town of Bethlehem, which is in right stage. You remember that some wise men came to Herod the Great, who was ruling at that time, a very paranoid ruler, and said, "We've heard that a king of the Jews has been born. Where should we go find him?" Herod gets upset. His counselors come in and say, "Well, it says in the prophets that he would be born in Bethlehem." So Herod sends out word that all the children of Bethlehem, aged 2 and under, should be executed. Now, Bethlehem is a very small village, so maybe we're talking about a dozen, perhaps as many as 24 kids who are 2 and younger, but that would probably be stretching it. But before that happens, Jesus' parents are warned by an angel, and so they flee down to Africa, to Egypt, and they're here for a couple of years until Herod the Great dies. Now, to understand the situation into which Jesus is born, we need to say a word about Herod's life, and particularly about his wills. Herod has a number of wives. He's covering all of his bases. In the year 12 BC, about 6 years before Jesus is born, Herod is married to a woman by the name of Doris. She gives him a son who bears the name Antipater, which was Herod's father's name. He's also married to a woman named Mariamne. She's a Hasmonean. We're going to talk a little bit later about Hasmoneans, but they were the ruling family for about a century before Herod comes to power. He marries her to cement legitimate ties to the throne. Mariamne is reputedly the most beautiful woman in the world. She gives him 2 sons. They're named Alexander and Aristobulus. He's also married to a Samaritan woman, just in case they have any legitimate claim on the throne. Her name is Malthace, and she gives him 2 sons, Archelaus and Antipas. He's also married to another woman named Mariamne, whom we'll call Mariamne II, and she gives birth to a son named Philip, which we will call Philip I, because he's also married to a woman named Cleopatra, who gives him a son that he names Philip. We'll call him Philip II. Now, this Cleopatra is not Elizabeth Taylor. That's Cleopatra of Egypt. This is Cleopatra of Jerusalem. In 12 BC, Herod wants to make sure that his kingdom is not given back to the Romans who empowered him to be king of Judea. He wants to pass on the rule to his sons. So he draws up a will in which he makes Antipater, Alexander, and Aristobulus joint heirs ruling his country at his death. Well, Antipater is the older of the group, and he's concerned that he shouldn't have to share the throne with these other guys. So over the next 2 or 3 years, he begins to sow the seeds of palace intrigue. He begins to sow in his father's mind the idea that Alexander and Aristobulus are planning an assassination to get rid of their daddy so they can come to power. Well, finally, Herod becomes very concerned about that, and in the year 7 BC, to solve any potential problem, he simply murders Alexander and Aristobulus, gets them out of the way, draws up a new will in which Antipater is the sole ruler at his death. Well, Antipater's very ambitious, and he begins to do his own form of political intrigue to try and maneuver things so that his father will be either overthrown or be executed, be assassinated. Herod gets wind of that. He gets his concerns about Antipater, and so the next time he draws up a will, a couple of years later in 5 BC, he takes Antipater out of the will, and he makes Antipas, Malthace's son, the sole heir of his kingdom. But he has a problem. He's concerned about that because Antipas is only 16 years old. And Herod's in pretty bad health, and he's afraid that if he were to die, Antipas wouldn't be able to handle the kingdom and the Romans would take it away from him. And so his whole purpose would be defeated. So the next year, he solves all of his problems by executing Antipater, who he thinks is trying to still get the throne back somehow. He's been telling his daddy, you need to change your will. You can't trust Antipas. He's too young, all those kinds of things. So he kills Antipater, and he writes a will in which he makes Archelaus, Antipas, and Philip I joint heirs of his kingdom when he dies. Later that year, Herod the Great indeed does die, and his kingdom is divided among these three sons. Now, Archelaus has a problem. Archelaus is the oldest of these three, and he thinks he ought to be the main guy. So he makes a trip to Rome to plead his case before the Roman Senate, who has to ratify his rulership. When he goes, there's a contingent of about 50 people that go with him. He thinks they're going to be his supporters. I mean, after all, his mother's in the group. When they get there, most of them say, "Ixnay on this." He's terrible. Archelaus has a horrible personality, totally unfit to be a ruler. He's worse than his daddy Herod ever thought about being. So even his own mother says, "Don't want this guy to be king over us." So the emperor decides, this is what we'll do. We will make Archelaus an ethnarch, and we'll make Antipas and Philip tetrarchs. Now, an ethnarch is a notch above a tetrarch, but a notch below being king. It says, we'll check you out and we'll see how you're doing. And if you function okay and demonstrate that you can handle it, then we'll review your case and see about making you king over the whole country. That's in 4 BC. About 10 years later, in 6 AD, Archelaus goes back to Rome and says, I think I've done a pretty good job. And I think I deserve to be king just like my daddy was over the whole country. Again, there's a contingent of people who come along and say, he's horrible, he's terrible. And the emperor says, okay, Archelaus, you're out of here, and banishes him to Gaul. And then he sends a direct proconsul from Rome to Palestine to govern the land. The fifth of those proconsuls is a guy named Pontius Pilatus, Pontius Pilate. In 4 BC, when Herod dies, Joseph and Mary and Jesus, who's now a couple of years old, are told by an angel that Herod and all that crew that were seeking to take your life have now died, and you can go back home. The Bible says that Joseph came back to Israel, but when he got here, he heard that Archelaus was ruling over Judea and Samaria. That bothered him because he knows about Archelaus. He's worse than his daddy Herod. So they decide to bypass Bethlehem and move on up north to Galilee, where they will live in the village of Nazareth. Nazareth is a unique little village. We're going to describe that for you in just a moment. But first, notice this text in Matthew chapter 2, beginning in verse 21. So Joseph got up, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Having been warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee, and he went and lived in a town called Nazareth. So was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, he shall be called a Nazarene. Now we have a problem here. There is no prophecy in all the Hebrew Scriptures that says the Messiah will be called a Nazarene. So what are we to make of this? How are we to understand what Matthew is telling us here? Let me give you a little word study, and I hope you can follow this. The word for Nazareth in Greek is Nazareth. It is the Greek form of the Hebrew name Netzer. Netzer is the Hebrew word that means branch. It's a messianic name. You remember that the people in Galilee were taken away into captivity by the Assyrians in 722 BC. Later, the southern tribes were taken into captivity by the Babylonians a couple of hundred years later. And then in 536 BC, the Jews were allowed under Cyrus to go back to their homeland. Most Jews did not return. Most of them stayed in Babylon because their life was secure there. They had their businesses, they had their homes, everything was wonderful. But across the next 5 centuries, more and more Jews immigrated back to Israel. Well, here was a group of people who could trace their lineage to David. This small clan decided to go back to Israel. When they got back, things in Jerusalem were so corrupt because you had people ruling, Hasmoneans, who had no legitimate right to the throne and they had no legitimate right to the high priesthood, but they were controlling both. Well, these people who were very conservative and very dedicated to Scripture decided they would settle in Galilee instead of Judea. They go up on the hills, and here they pick an isolated spot, and they settle a village, and they name it Netzer, or Branch Town. We could call it Netzerville. One who is descended from David is sometimes called a Nazarios, one who is from the Netzer clan, one who can trace their lineage back to David. In Isaiah 11:1, the prophet said, "A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots, a branch, a Netzer, will bear fruit." So most likely when Matthew says this fulfilled the prophecy that he would be called a Nazarene, he doesn't mean somebody that comes from the town of Nazareth. He means one who has the branch, one who can trace their lineage back to David, one who has a legitimate claim to being the Messiah. And so Jesus is called the Netzer, the branch. And I think that helps answer a question I had for a lot of years. In Luke chapter 18, verse 35, we were told that Jesus and His disciples approached Jericho, and a blind beggar was sitting there beside the road. And when he heard the noise of a crowd going past, he asked what was happening. They told him that Jesus of Nazareth was going by. And so he began shouting, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Now when I read that, I would ask, they say, "Oh, it's Jesus of Nazareth going by." And immediately this blind man who can't see him, doesn't know anything else about him, says, "Jesus, Son of David." How did he know he was a son of David? Because he came from Netzerville. He came from Branch Town. And the only people that live in Branch Town are people that could trace their lineage back to David, this clan. And so they said, "Who is going by?" The crowd said, "It's Jesus the Netzer." If you looked at the Greek text, that's what it says. Jesus the branch is going by. And so Bartimaeus can cry out, "Jesus, Son of David, you who are the Messiah, help me, have mercy on me." Well, Joseph takes his family, they leave Egypt, they come back to Palestine, and rather than settling in Judea, they go to Galilee. They go up to the top of the hill there in central Galilee to this little village where they have relatives, and they settle in Netzerville. Very small community, just maybe a couple of hundred people live there in Bible times. It's not mentioned at all in the Old Testament. It's not mentioned in the Talmud, this collection of rabbinical writings collected through the first 400 years after the time of Jesus. Very inconsequential and out of the way. Listen, nobody goes to Netzerville unless you just absolutely had to. You don't accidentally go through it. You had to go there by choice. It is so out of the way. But that's where they wanted to be because they're ultra-conservative. They are very rigid. They are very orthodox. And they don't want anybody messing up their life in Galilee. And remember, this is Galilee of the Gentiles, because there are a lot of Gentiles who live up here. So they are withdrawn, isolated, kind of have their own holy huddle, and that's where they live, and that's where Jesus grows up. Now, if we come back to our diagram again, we want to focus in now on Galilee. Galilee is in left stage. For the most part, Galilee covers about 25 miles east and west, 35 miles north and south. That's it. And Jesus spends most of His public ministry in this area. So let's talk for a moment about Galilee. The capital of Galilee is a place called Sepphoris. Sepphoris is centrally located. It's west of the Sea of Galilee. In Herod the Great's time, Sepphoris was an administrative center for Galilee. When Herod dies and Herod Antipas gets Galilee, then he makes it his capital city. But here's the problem. When Herod the Great died, there was a fellow named Judas of Hezekiah, this is 4 BC, who says, all right, this tyrant, this paranoid ruler has died. This is the prime time for us. Let's revolt. Let's throw off this Roman rule. After all, Herod was just a puppet of Rome. Let's throw it off and let's get our independence again. Well, the Romans sent 2 legions down from Syria and they destroyed Sepphoris, just leveled the town. Well, now Herod Antipas inherits Galilee at his father's death. He says, I need to rebuild this city. So they begin a long-term construction project in rebuilding Sepphoris. Sepphoris is just 3 miles from Nazareth. I believe that Joseph, who was a carpenter, and his son Jesus, who was being trained to be a carpenter, every day made the trek from the top of the hill down into the valley 3 miles away to work at Sepphoris. After all, Netzerville is a very small community. You're not going to live being a carpenter in this little town. There's not going to be that much work. But for weeks, for months, for years, this project would go on. And Joseph and Jesus and his other sons could be involved in this building project. Eventually, the city of Sepphoris is rebuilt. It's a magnificent city. But there's another problem. Just about the time Herod Antipas is winding up this project, his half-brother Philip, who rules on the other side of the Sea of Galilee in a territory called Gaulonitis, has built a new city, and he's named it after the new emperor's daughter. He's called it Bethsaida Julius, after Tiberius' daughter Julia. Well, that means that Philip is getting in really good with the emperor, naming a town after him. Well, Herod Antipas can't be outdone, so he decides he'll build a new capital city and name it after the emperor. So he goes over to the Sea of Galilee, and right on the western shore, he builds a new town, and he names it Tiberias in honor of the emperor, so he can get in his good points with this new emperor. Now, with this in mind, we want to talk about the land as resource. As we do that, remember now that there are Jews and Gentiles in this land. There are about 250,000 Gentiles. There are about 100,000 Jews in Jesus' day. And they are working the land. What's this land like? Well, Josephus describes it in this way. In his book, The Jewish Wars, chapter 3, section 34, he says, the whole area is excellent for crops or cattle and rich in forests of every kind, so that by its adaptability it invites even those least inclined to work on the land. This is our guy laying in the hammock throwing his seed out there. Consequently, every inch has been cultivated by the inhabitants, and not a corner goes to waste. The whole country is cultivated and fruitful from end to end. This is an incredibly fruitful land, as we've said. It is an enormous resource for the people. And the farmer becomes a very important person in this country, as you can imagine. Now, I'll tell you, they do have some goat herding, they do have some shepherding in Galilee, but very little, because you want to use the land for its growth potential, for its ability to produce great crops. And so you'll see a farmer go out and plow his land. He plows it the long way, and then he takes his seed and he walks through there and he broadcasts it as he goes. Pliny the Elder, a Roman writer, says the good farmer will match his stride with the arc of his arm so that he broadcasts his seed evenly. When he's finished scattering seed across his land, and some will fall on the pathway, and some will fall on rocks, and some will be in thorny land, but most of it will fall in good soil. When he's scattered all of his seed, then he will plow it perpendicular to the way that he plowed it before to cover it under. And then all of the rain will come, and the crops will grow, and then he'll be able to harvest it and then winnow it if he's growing wheat. And you'll have this great crop. And you look out across the fields of Galilee, you just see acre after acre after acre of wheat and other crops. God spoke of this back in the Old Testament in Deuteronomy 8:8, when He said that this is going to be a land with wheat and barley, vines and fig trees, pomegranates, olive oil, and honey, or davage, this produce that grows from the land. So they get all kinds of things here. They get olives and olive oil as a byproduct. You get grapes and wine as a byproduct. Cucumbers, barley, flax, beans, onions. All of these things and much more grow in this land. And so the farmer is a very important person in the land of Galilee. And Jesus tells many stories that have to do with farmers. One of the important things that grows in Galilee, actually it grows all over the country. It's amazing where you can grow olive trees. But olives are really important. Of course, you can eat them. You can use the olive oil for cooking. You use the olive oil for medicine. You use the olive oil in your lamps as the source for your wicks fuel. So having olive trees is very, very, very important. But olive trees have to be planted quite a distance apart. So you grow other crops in between them. The farmer is a very important character in the land of Israel. There are other industries here. Artisans, carpenters, masons, merchants, people who make wine presses and wheat presses. Let me say a word about carpenters for just a moment. We talked about the fact that Joseph and his son Jesus was a carpenter. When you think of carpenter, you usually think of somebody that works with wood. And Jesus may have worked some with wood. But the Greek word is tekton. It means somebody that works with hard substances. It may be lumber. It may be stone. It could be ivory. Anybody who works with a hard substance and knows how to fashion it, shape it into something useful, is a tekton. You get a group of them together and you need a leader. The leader is called the architecton, or the architect. He's the one who designs what we're going to do here. Jesus is a tekton. I think his primary building source is not wood. It's stone. They built their houses out of stone. They built wheat presses out of stone. They built wine presses out of stone. They built all kinds of things. You go to Israel today, you're going to find out if there's ever a market for stone, they're going to get wealthy over there. Lots of stone in Galilee. And Jesus worked this stone, shaping it into whatever you needed it to be, a wheat press or a wine press or whatever. And when I think about Jesus using all of these stones, I don't get the Hollywood image of a wimp. Here's a man who's muscular, who's strong, who's moved all of these heavy stones and with his hammer and chisel shaped them into whatever useful item people needed. And so carpenters are very important, and Jesus is a part of the Guild of Carpenters. And then also the wheat press business. I'll say a word about that. The image over on the right are wheat presses. This is for the first pressing of the wheat. You pour your wheat in the top. You can perhaps see a hole in the center where you would put a post in, and then your animal will turn it, or your son, or you, if you don't own an animal, and the wheat falls out at the bottom. Now this one in the center is damaged, but the wheat would fall out here and you would catch it on a sheet of some kind. And then when your wife is ready to cook, she goes out in the courtyard where women do this every day, and two women sit opposite each other on this smaller wheat press, which is about 12 or 14 inches across. It's made of two stones, one on top of the other. They pour the wheat in the center, and there's a stick in this hole on the right side, and a woman will reach out and grab it and pull it back to her. The woman across from her will grab it and pull it back to her. And they will turn this several times until the wheat is ground very fine. Then they take the top stone off, take the wheat out, put the stone back on, pour more wheat in, and start the process over. You may remember in Luke 17:35, Jesus said 2 women will be grinding flour together at the mill. One will be taken, the other left. They did that every day out in the courtyard where women would meet and work these mills together. Jesus is speaking to something that they're very familiar with in their world. Not only is the farmer a very important person in the land of Galilee, but so also is the fisherman. The Sea of Galilee dominates the land of Galilee. We call it the Sea of Galilee. In Hebrew, it's called Kinneret. It means harp, and you can tell this is harp-shaped. The Greeks come along, and they can't pronounce the Hebrew word correctly, so they say Gennesaret. And today, it's even further corrupted. They call it Gennosar. And for a while, it was called the Sea of Tiberias in honor of the Emperor Tiberius. But it is a fascinating body of water, and we referred to this in our first session when we talked about it. It's 7 miles wide, east and west, at its widest point. It's 12 miles long, north and south, at its greatest length. It sits 690 feet below sea level, as we've said before, the only freshwater lake in the world below sea level, and contains these 23 different types of fish. We call it the Sea of Galilee, but it's not a sea. Only being 7 miles across, you can see to the other side very easily. You can see what's going on. You can see the Golan Heights over on the eastern side. Now, the Sea of Galilee sits in a very strategic position. It's called the Via Maris. There's a major highway that comes down out of Mesopotamia, comes from Damascus, comes down along the Jordan Valley, and comes down to a place that we call Capernaum. At Capernaum, there's a toll. You're changing provinces, so you have to pay the toll collector a fee when you cross into his province or when you're about to leave his province. Now, we know the names of one of the tax collectors or toll collectors in Capernaum. His name is Matthew, the tax collector. Well, the people would come down from Damascus along the Via Maris, which means the way by the sea. They come to the Sea of Galilee, pay their toll, and then go around the northwestern corner of the lake and go across Galilee about 25 miles till they come to the Mediterranean Sea. And then you go south down along the Mediterranean Sea to Egypt. This is the most natural caravan route. It's the superhighway of the day. It's just not paved. It's a dirt trail. But it is the trail from Damascus to Egypt that has the least amount of climbing hills and the least amount of going down into valleys and back out. It's where you stay the levelest, the longest by going along this route. Well, when Jesus grows up, he grows up in Netzerville, Nazareth. This little Hooterville of a town, up on the hills, out of the way where nobody ever comes. Are you going to have a great public ministry if your international headquarters are in Netzerville? No, because you're not ever going to have anybody to talk to. So Jesus leaves Nazareth, goes 17 miles over to the Sea of Galilee, and goes to Capernaum. It's a town of about 1,500 people in Jesus' day. But it is a key town because, as I've said, this is where you cross the border and this is where you pay your toll or your taxes. And Jesus knows He's going to touch a lot of lives right here. He's going to touch international trade as they come through. This is a key place to be. Now, when you come to the Sea of Galilee, there's another thing that you need to remember about it. If we draw a line from north to south through the lake, we can divide it into two parts. To the west, we have Galilee. The Jews would refer to this as our side. This is where we live. Over on the other side, we have their side. That's where Gaulonitis is. That's where the Decapolis is. That's where Gentiles live. Jews don't live over there. Jews live on our side. To the east, their side, pagan territory. They believe it's the land of demons. You don't want to go over there. Bad stuff happens over on their side. So Jews stay over on our side. Now, we read about some of the apostles being fishermen. Well, when they fish, they just stay around the edges. They don't go out in the deep. They don't go out to the middle of the lake. They stay around the edges because there are underground springs there in the lake and it attracts the fish. And so they just do all their fishing a few yards offshore. One day, Jesus climbs into Peter's boat and says, "Oh, come on, guys, let's go to the other side." And they said, "What for? Why do we want to go over there? That's pagan territory. That's where Satan lives. That's where the demons are. We don't want to go over there." Jesus says, "Come on, we're going." So they go to the other side. When they dock, do you remember what happened? This wild man comes out of the caves. He's naked. He's demon-possessed. He's berserk. He's yelling. He's screaming. He's cutting himself and bleeding. And the apostle said, "See, I told you. Let's go. Everybody back in the boat." And Jesus comes and confronts the man and says, "What's your name?" And the demons say, "Legion," because we're many. And Jesus commands them to come out of him. You remember the story. They go in the pigs. It's the first case of deviled ham in the Bible. They all run over the cliff and drowned in the lake. And the man sitting there in his right mind. The pig herders run back into town, tell the owner of the pigs what's happened. They come back out. They find the man in his right mind. They're amazed. Jesus gets ready to leave. I mean, apparently he just came over for this one encounter. Jesus gets back in the boat, and this man who was formerly demon-possessed says, "Let me go with you." And Jesus says, "No. You stay here and tell everybody how much the Lord has done for you." Have you ever noticed that sometimes when Jesus heals people, He says, "Don't tell anybody." And other times He'll say, "Go and tell." What's the difference? Well, I think if you'll check it out, a lot of the time you'll find that when He's on our side, where people believe in God, but have a faulty understanding of who the Messiah is and what He's going to do, Jesus says, "Don't tell." Because I've got to have some time to train the people to change the way they think about who the Messiah is. But when He's on their side and they have no witness for the living God, Jews don't live there, and they need a testimony, He says, "Go tell." Now, follow that. That won't always be true, but see how often that happens in the Gospels. The farmer and the fisherman, two very important groups of people. The farmer has great land to work with. The fisherman has a wonderful body of water, gorgeous, beautiful land in which to do his fishing. I should tell you that on the Sea of Galilee, if you look at the diagram on the right, this model of the Sea of Galilee shows us how the sea sits in a depression. It's surrounded by hills on all sides. That gives us a unique phenomenon. You have cold air coming from the west off the Mediterranean, moving across the top of the hills, going over the Sea of Galilee. But you have warm water coming from the sun heating up the Sea of Galilee. You have this warm air rising. And when that warm air gets to the cold air, it wants to get up above it. And so it pushes it, and finally, it'll turn it over. And when it inverts it so that the hot air can escape, you end up with a storm. And so in 60 minutes' time, you can go from dead calm to 8-foot waves on the Sea of Galilee. It's incredible. It's one of the reasons the disciples don't like to get out on the lake. They get out there and suddenly this storm comes up and they're swamped and they think they're going to die. And Jesus comes walking on the water to the disciples. You remember the story. And I never have figured this test out. Peter says, "Lord, if it's you, let me come walking to you on the water." Now, is that a natural kind of response? Is that what would first come to your mind? I mean, you'd step out of the boat, go straight down, drown, think, I guess that wasn't right. That doesn't seem like a logical test to me, but it's what he says. Jesus says, "Come on." So Peter turns to the other guys and he says, "Hey, fellas, I'm going to walk on the water." From the back of the boat, Thomas says, "I doubt it." But he steps out and he starts walking on the water. About that time he's halfway there, a cold wave slaps him in the face, and Peter thinks, "What am I doing out here?" And he looks at the waves instead of at Jesus, and he starts to drown. Jesus grabs him, walks him back to the boat, they get in, and immediately the water's calm again. That's how it is on the lake. Storms come and go. The Jews were basically landlubbers. They fished around the edges, but they didn't like to get out on the water because it was so frightening. And I think that's why in the book of Revelation, when John sees a sea, it's a sea of glass. In fact, he says, in the end, there is no more sea. We got rid of that thing. We don't have to face that anymore. So I kind of suspect that when Jesus said to Peter and Andrew and James and John, "Hey guys, give up fishing and come and follow me," Peter probably said, "Sounds like a great idea to me. I just really don't like being out on the water very much." Okay, we're going to take a break here and come back in our next session and finish talking about the religious and the politics of Galilee in Jesus' time and how that influenced his life and ministry.